Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's video is actually going to be two things. I've been asked a couple of questions, and sorry, microphone call was displaced. And I've wanted to answer them. Sorry, new chair, it's very squeaky. Comfy, but squeaky. And I wanted to answer these two questions, but I couldn't feel comfortable with making whole videos about them. Either of them. Now, the first question was, it was secondhand, but Travis brought it through to me. Somebody asked in a forum, why do you never see mix videos, videos about making a mix, that are taking a crappy mix and turning it into a good mix. Now, I have done one of those, and obviously my mix walkthrough videos are shades of that, hence Travis passing it to me to say, hey, what do you think? No, my first reaction was actually the same reaction as came from somebody else who knows what he's doing, and he said essentially, there's no such thing as a bad mix. There are some times where people really don't make the right decisions, but that's not a mix. That's not somebody who knows how to mix. But a bad mix is normally a result of a bad composition. So if your piece was written right, as in you knew what it was about, and you managed to get, a reasonable amount, let's say 80% of that idea on paper or in your DAW, then the mix itself shouldn't be hard, and it should never be that far wrong. So in terms of taking a terrible mix and turning it into a great mix, it's a matter of degrees. It's that, shall we say, extra 20%, but let's say it's really only 10% because we never get 100% of what we want. Never, ever, ever. If we went to Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson and asked them about Thriller, did it work out exactly the way you hoped? They'd probably go, fuck no. We thought we'd kind of failed with this record. But it's Thriller! So don't chase 100%. So, no. If your mix is bad, like bad, it means that you haven't understood what you're writing, because you don't know how to mix it. And I'm leaving that for a moment to help you perhaps think on that. A lot of people do think that making music these days is about finding the right blammin' sounds, making the right blammin' mix, and the right blamming master, so they can blam it all over Spotify and get, hookers with massive tits and cocaine, but it's not music. There are some people who manage to do that, and I guess good on them and whatever, if that's your thing, but it ain't music. So, if you're struggling with the idea of how to mix, assuming you have to mix this, and that's often a false assumption, the wiser assumption would probably be to find someone, explain the story of what your piece is about, get them to agree that your piece is representing this, and they'll mix it. But if that, for whatever reason, is not an option, you're no good at making friends with people, you're not able to ask people, hey Benedict, can you do a mix walkthrough for me? Let's say you absolutely positively have to do this because you're the only person in your universe. Then step back. You can't make a bad mix if you know what your piece is about. If you've chosen the right instruments, given good performances, which carry the nuance and expression of what your piece is about, have got a nice arrangement, which again carries what your piece is about. Then when it comes time to just putting it all together, it's largely all together already. You might sort of go, okay, look, we'll finesse that balance here, just so that it expresses what it's meant to do a little bit better. And that's it. Here's a piece that I did yesterday. It was composed pretty quickly. In many ways it is garbage. The style is corporate. As you see up here, it says corporate 01. I was toying with the idea of, okay, how is that ghastly corporate music written? You're sitting there in work and the boss shows you this video and you're like, oh God, that music, I think I just want to kill people. It's a special style when people write it that way, and bosses actually want it to sound like that, so that their video is all Of course, they're too dumb to realise that when they're watching it, that everybody just wants to go on a killing spree. Nonetheless. And so on and so on. This didn't need any mixing, really. Not in the way that most people think that mixings are bad, you know, having to do producery shit all over the place. Here's my mix. As you see, they're basically all the same. A couple of dB up on the piano, because pianos easily disappear inside a mix. Don't know why, they just do. They easily disappear. Back a little bit on the flute, because the flute ended up quite loud, largely in part because I pushed it somewhere else, because it was underneath the mix most of the time. I pushed it at the instrument and then realised, no, I need to pull that back a little bit just to get it to balance. Most of the mix, per se, was done in the EQs. See, so they're all on. So if we pull them up, F2, a little bit to make some more of that kick drum, because I actually pulled out a lot of the oomph, because it's not supposed to be because it's corporate, and probably going to be played on like a laptop or something really crappy sounding, so we don't want to waste a lot of our energy on subs, because it's not corporate hip-hop. It's far too much of that shit. Bass, again, as usual, it's actually made dominant in first or second harmonic. Again, lets it come through nicely on crappy speakers. Piano, just push some of the mids just to poke that through the mix. Strings, we don't want too much happening in the low end. There's other stuff happening there. Just basically tilting them so that they seem a bit brighter. The guitar, again, just finding a point where we can poke it through the mix. Flutes, they can always use a little bit of a poke there just to bring them up, and the vocals, the same sort of thing. That is the mix. It doesn't need any more than that. And you might go, oh, but I dismiss everything you're saying, Bennett, because it's not like a storm and metal track with like 909s and yeah. It's like, yeah, fuck off. You're not fit to make music if that's the way you think. And I know you're probably super offended and looking for the stop button and the dislike on Facebook, but stop. You wanted to watch this video because you wanted to try and understand something. So before you send me a hand grenade or a thumb down, and if you must put a thumb down, then please have the downstairs to actually type out why you don't like it. And before you do that, please make that coherent and not just all about how you're disappointed with your life, because that ain't my problem. And if you try and make it my problem, I'll sure make it yours again. So, this is the mix. The EQ is the mix. That's all you need to do. You don't need to do all kinds of producery shit. Because when I wrote this, I made sure the notes lined up. I made sure the arrangement made sense. And that's it. It mixes itself. So in terms of taking a terrible mix and turning it into a great mix, it shouldn't be a necessary thing. Hi, Jane. So to answer that guy's core question, why don't you see it? You kind of do, so the guy probably hadn't tried hard enough. But largely, you don't need to see it, because if the material's written badly, you're always going to end up with basically a bad mix. If the material's written well, it's not hard. Now, you're wanting some kind of insider secret, so let me give you one. Work to the material. So this is a killing spree kind of corporate, in which case I work to that. If I get this and say that I'm going to work it and turn it into some kind of big room EDM, we're never going to get a good mix, because that's not the style of this music. It's not what it's meant to do. You could decide to do a remix, in which case you could take my wonderful melodies, put super saws on them and put your 909s in and stuff, but then you kind of got a new piece of music. And as you're doing that rework, you're actually thinking big room, techno, people in glow-in-the-dark clothes. So you're actually building your mix from the ground up. If you take this and try and repurpose it simply by doing producery shit to it, you'll end up with something that sounds worse than this. Don't do it. Don't do it. It won't work out. Work to the material you've got. Now, if you happen to be working with Black Sabbath, with Ronnie James Dio out front, then you've got a good drummer, a good bass player, you've got a good guitarist, and one of the best singers that ever walked the boards. So you've got great material. It's going to mix itself super easy. As long as you stay on purpose. If you're trying to mix it like it's new age or something, then you're off purpose. But if you mix to your material, easy. A lot of you, however, do have the situation where you've got less than perfect material. The trick here is not to hide it. If it's that terrible, if your singer is that terrible that they should not be on stage, they should not be singing on a record, make the executive ballsy decision and get yourself a new singer. Maybe that drummer called Phil can actually sing. Or say to your singer, look man, your singing's not quite working for what we're trying to achieve. Can you let go of the idea of trying to sing properly and just kind of rip into it? Focus on what this is about. In other words, you seek his character, which is the secret here. What is the character of what you've got? If I've got Sabbath with Dio, and they've just tracked what's going to become Heaven and Hell album, go have a listen to it, because that's how the mix is going to sound. If I've got, let's say, Lou Reed, who possibly should never have been allowed to sing at all, based on technical laws, I've got a guy who writes amazing songs, tremendous stories, plays one weird kooky guitar, and sings like, well, Lou Reed. So rather than trying to hide that, auto-tuning him, using boosters to double his voice and try and hide the fact that he sings like Lou Reed, work to the very thing that makes Lou unique. Blah 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 is his weird way of playing guitar solo. Great! Make something of that. Really do. If you're into Joy Division, Ian Curtis's guitar playing was unique. He tried to back away from playing the guitar because he thought he was shit at it. And yeah, in some ways he was. But when you put that on record, what you got was something that really stood out. It was a big part of Joy Division. So they said to him, Ian, no, you need to play guitar because your guitar playing is great. So when you've got your material, so long as it is passionate, find the quirky things and push them, because that's going to make your record stand out. Yes, some people who only like to listen to Whitney Houston may come along and go, fuck, that Lou Reed guy is shit. But what does it matter? You're not chasing them anyway, because there are going to be some other people who come along and go, bugger me, that Lou Reed guy has just blown my head. So, mix to what you've got. Don't try and hide it. Play to the quirks and the characters and the strengths of what you've got. Then you can never have a bad mix. Alright, let's get rid of this. No, I don't need to say any of that. Part 2. Now the question was the usual thing of how do I get that bass sound? And I'll run through a couple of things, but the first thing is the most recent. A guy was showing an Alpha Juno video so a synth that comes out in the mid-80s, and he's saying, how do I make that sound? And initially he was trying to make it with Thor. Now, and then he was saying, oh, but I've tried this VST and that VST, and I can't get it right. No, you can't. I haven't heard what you're trying to do, but no, you can't, because A, you haven't learnt how synthesis works. You haven't learnt the little details, because it's the little details that separate a bass sound made with an Alpha Juno from a bass sound made with a Mini Moog. They can be almost exactly the same, but they're going to sound different, and it's in the tiny, tiny, tiny details. That's what you've got to focus on if you're going to do this kind of work. So, number one thing to do is my best friend, Google. We Google the Alpha Juno, and we find out some stuff about it, which I don't need to do because I know a bit about Alpha Junos anyway. Didn't own one, but people around me owned them, and, you know, I came up in that era. So, an Alpha Juno is an analog oscillator, however, it's digitally controlled. So it's far more like a digital oscillator. It's actually far more like a VST than, say, a Jupiter 8 or a Mini Moog or an MS-20. It's tight. It's clean. It's also one oscillator. It's a single oscillator, like a 106. There's one of those suckers in there. And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty confident with it being a DCO that it's probably phase-locked as well. All of those little bits of information give me quite a lot to understand about how those sounds work. Also, by knowing the nature of the times of the Alpha Juno, is that the Alpha Juno was Roland's answer to trying to fend off everybody going off and buying Yamaha DX7, which is a digital synth, and Casio obviously with their synths. So it wasn't a synth that was meant to sound like a Jupiter 4. Despite carrying the Juno line, it had nothing to do with the Junos at all. It was really an attempt to create a DX7E type thing, just using their existing architecture of oscillators and stuff. Throw in a little bit of digital shit, take all the knobs off. We have a Roland trying to get into the DX territory. So that defines the sound you hear. So let's start. I'm going to start with Europa. Now, notice I said I don't recommend Thor. You could do it with Thor, but if I were using Thor, I'd use a phase distortion or an FM oscillator to create my main oscillator sound. Two reasons. One, Thor's VCO or analog oscillators are not phase locked, and they're meant to be more Mini Moog, Jupiter 4 type feel. So you're at cross purposes if you start with the wrong oscillator. So I would choose one of the digital forms because they're going to be far more like what you hear coming out of that alpha. But we'll go with this one because it's got a button already. Oh, the other advice I gave to the guy was actually use a subtractor because of the filter. We'll discuss that later. But I'm going to go with this guy. Default sound is a sine wave. Obviously not what we want. Let's turn this up till we get a... Now I know through reading that the Alpha Juno came with quite a few different wave shapes. So in other words, the fact that it's got all these different wave shapes means that it's also more like a digital synth. It hasn't just got a saw, a square, a sine. It's got these different wave shapes already built in. So let's go to a sawtooth because that's a common sound. We're going to drop ourselves an octave, and we're going to phase lock this. So phase sync, basically that means that it starts at the beginning of its waveform, let's say here, every single time a note is played, rather than sometimes starting here, sometimes starting there, sometimes starting there, which gives you a looser, more analogy sound. But one of his concerns was that he could never get that clarity and tightness of bass, he called it, but it's the start of the sound that actually gives you that. And being phase linked or synced means that it's starting in the same place every time, so it sounds tighter. So easy. It would be very tempting these days to turn on the unison. This didn't exist back then, so keep that sucker off until you're looking at a 80-80 or something like that. It's not on. Leave that off. And besides, when you phase locked, it sounds kind of funny. What we did have all over the Alpha Juno, however, was a chorus. It was stereoed, and we tended to use lots of it. So you've got two options. One is to take your depth as much as you can and use a fairly slow rate so that you haven't got this going on. Or turn your rate up and the amount down. You're looking for lots of movement because we've got one oscillator, we want to busy it up. But your chorus is a big part of that. I'll turn that on because chances are people would have had that on when they were making these sounds in the first place. Filters. Now remember, Alpha Juno, a lot of those sounds were designed to emulate DX7 type sounds. So the filters, while they were there and weren't a bad filter, they didn't self-oscillate, they were a pretty mild filter. This'll do. So we now we're starting to get into that territory straight away. I don't know about keyboard scaling, but I'll turn it off. Because you largely don't want a keyboard scale for a bass sound, otherwise your higher notes start to get a bit pointy. Not cool. Turn up our envelope. Our envelope shape is of course wrong for this kind of sound, so we will turn it into this. Now again, I don't actually know what Alpha Juno's envelope shapes were. Were they linear? It's entirely possible that they were actually linear. But they may still have been exponential, logarithmic, what have you. Doesn't make much difference. Experiment, find the sound you want. This isn't about emulating Alpha Junos, because I bet you that 99% of those of you who are looking to emulate Alpha Junos, Juno 106s, anything like that, you're actually making synthwave, retrowave, which sounds nothing like 1985 at all. In which case, it doesn't matter whether this is linear or exponential or whatever. Find the sound that you want. So we've got the point where we're going fairly muted in our tone. This is a bass sound, we just want that kind of thing that sounds great. But we need that attack. Obviously to taste. The Alpha Juno had that great big alpha dial, so everybody would have just gone and adjusted that to suit the music they were making. Not the mix, the music they were making. The mix was easy after that. That is basically it. There you go. That is your Alpha Juno bass sound. It is as simple as that. But the keys are phase locking, choose the option that better suits your piece. But if you're after a tighter, more digital DX7 type sound, phase lock that oscillator. Chorus. set this to suit. It's just going to depend on how you want that sound to sit in the mix. Obviously, slower with a greater depth means that the chorus is less noticeable. The sound itself becomes a little less fat, but you've got that movement while still sparing the main sound through the center. You can change your mix, obviously, which allows you to, again, push up your rate, lower your depth. You can overdo, that's overdone. Lots of options there as to how you do it. So you can overdo it and then pull the mix back. But I'm pretty confident that the chorus on the Alpha Juno probably had very few controls. So the moment you start to get into that kind of stuff, you're probably outside of the technical Juno anyway. Plus, we weren't stupid back then. We had other devices. So it could have been anything from a Boss chorus pedal through to like a Space Echo or something like that. Or if we're getting a few years later into a quadriverb or some other kind of chorus device. Here's a trick. Without using a chorus, here's something we can do. Obviously it messes with your timing just a tiny bit, but who are we to complain about timing? Let's turn this guy off. So another kind of chorus. So if we put the two together, we're getting the dual chorus, which was quite common in Roland products. In which case you might choose to go out to quite a long. Still fundamentally a pretty tight sound because it's one oscillator. The moment we get two oscillators, let's say we put a second one in, the Alpha Juno did have a sub oscillator. But let's be honest, we'll get that phase synced. It now sounds pretty flubby. It's not really that high energy Italo disco sound anymore because it's too flubby. That's because we've got that second oscillator in the way. We get rid of it. We come over all fancy. That's basically it. That's all you got to do. Now, that's just using the VST. One of the problems we have with VSTs is that they're very accurate. They're very clean and tidy. So we get to the end of this process of having done everything right and kind of feel like, I've done nothing right at all. This sounds like shit. Where's the passion? You know? Where's the hey hey guy? You know? It's not in our sound. It's nothing to do with our sound at all. Yes, we can EQ and what have you, but that's not relevant. There's no such thing as a set EQ. But there are these guys. I'll just turn them both on. Yep. Always got to remember the keep open. Remember that we're talking hardware, so it's like physical things with components. Every component adds noise. Everything in there adds noise. The converters, if there's any kind of digital to analog kind of thing, that's adding noise too. Your jacks that you stick in and stick somewhere else, adding noise. Everything was adding noise back then. So when you hear an Alpha Juno recorded in 1986, it will not sound the same as any Alpha Juno emulation, no matter how accurate it is, recorded in your DAW. Because unless they've taken a reasonable set of approximations of the kind of stuff that you would plug them into, remember I said possibly a Boss chorus pedal was a pretty common thing you might have found, or a Boss delay pedal or something like that, hanging off the end of an Alpha Juno. Unless they've modelled the distortions that happen in that process, the EQs, the general messing up of the signal, it will always sound flat and papery. So I'm going to show us two things. The first one will be this little fella. I just picked it up, was playing with it. So just with middle settings, straight away we hear that sound start to, and that's what we're looking at, remember? It's all subtle. The differences between using a mini Moog and an Alpha Juno is really very tiny. But once we've got a few of those little tinies, we actually feel them. We are designed to notice little differences. All people, they've all got 2 arms, 2 legs, a couple of eyes, a hole in the front that just won't shut. So how is it that we can recognize thousands of different people? Infinitely small details. So this, I don't know what it's doing, because the manual tells you nothing. It just says it's doing a lot of stuff. I should imagine that it's doing some kind of non-linear distortion-y process on the top end, and something similar-ish on the bottom end. But hear how suddenly that sound sounds a bit more, ooh. So not only was the jack on the back of your Alpha doing some of that stuff, but whatever you jacked it into and through was doing some of that stuff too. So that's one option that I've got plugged in. This one, I've got to control its level because it's prone to being a little excitable. Where is it there? Noise distortion, capable of doing some really ghastly sounds. But that one's reasonably mild. You can make it awful, but it's reasonably mild. Sounds nice. You know the other thing that was pretty common? These days we would tend to put our delay line after our drives. Back then, you were often putting a delay line through something else that was doing damage. Is that the right sound? Is that the sound you're after, Mr. Guy in forums? I don't know. You didn't show us a piece. Actually, you even had to find the sound you were trying to emulate. This is when it comes to building the right sound for the story of your piece. And hopefully you've gone some way to doing that at the beginning. And building your piece around that sound. That's really all you're going to do. But if you're using just a VST, and especially its onboard effects. Now, some have great onboard effects, but let me tell you, the drive in this, the distortion options in this, let's put them after. While they are good and they have their uses, and I use them quite a lot, and if it's all you've got, great, go for it. It's not the same as this. So learn your gear, learn how it works, and also learn to be subtle. Because if we take this fella, we haven't done anything good for ourselves at all. So learn your pieces of gear, have a few pieces of gear, and learn them. But these fellas, I've just picked up recently for free, just trying them, seeing what colours they can bring. They're pretty darn cool. This is a bit of a weird one. You've got to control it with a volume after the fact. Architecture leaves a little bit to be desired, but its drive modes are interesting and outside of things that I've already got. That's basically it. Know your gear, know what you're trying to do, and if you're emulating something with particular characteristics, work out what those characteristics are. Or hire somebody who does know what they're looking for, and that way you get the right sounds. Or you might be better off just simply saying, I'm going to make my own sound. I like that. And all with one oscillator. So I hope that's helped on both of those questions. How do I emulate, and how do we transition from a shit mix to a great mix? How you emulate is to understand what you're emulating and understand the little details, because that's where you're tripping yourself up, because you're not handling the little details. And if your mixes are shit, you're tripping yourself up because you're not actually handling the big details. You're so worried about the click that you're in your door, you know, what finite tick is my snare happening on, and not sitting big picture and thinking, what's my piece about? You've got no story. So big picture there, work out what your story is. When you're working on the details, then it's little picture. And this is what a good producer is about. A good producer is able to see both the big and little details at the same time. So are the little details, like is that supporting my big picture? If it's not, we need to work on it. Not in the mix, when it's too bloody late to fix anything. If that's supposed to be a trumpet line, we got some problems. Not fit for purpose. But if we say, okay, this is the sound we're using, and we play to that, let's say Elton John's Nikita. Hey Nikita, is it cold? There's a superb, I think it's DX7 horn line in that. Does it sound like a trumpet? No. Is it wonderful? Bloody hell, it's wonderful. So you can use things that are not fit for purpose, like Lou Reed singing, to make fit for purpose, but it's still got to fit the big picture. We can make things that give us that Alpha Juno feel just by understanding the little details, but also by understanding the big picture, the environment that they lived in, which is where we add some doohickeys that give us some of what was really going on at that time. It wasn't the ownership of an Alpha Juno that made us sound like Fancy or any of the other Italo disco type guys, the high energy guys. It was the stuff that they were doing with it that made them sound that way. So rather than making the easy mistakes, move out to look at things give you that feel, and to do things like putting some of your effects into your processors, or even EQing. That has to be a trumpet line. It's now more trumpety, just by going to about 3K, putting a couple of dB on it. Changes the way these guys react. Makes it a little harder, because remember, a trumpet's actually a piece of tin that we're making rattle. Easy. Thank you. You have a good day now.